Today, 3% of the world's population are said to be migrants. And that is pretty low, because it means that 97% are not. But the pace of change is rather startling. So just a few years ago, the same figure was 2%, meaning that in just a few years, 1% of all human beings became migrants. Okay, so what's a migrant? You'll think of movers, exile, displaced people. You'll think of nomads, jet-setters, erratic loonies, all sorts of people. Causes for migration, the same. You'll think of war, famine, poverty, natural disasters, climate change, but also, of course, a search for a better life, work, study, and also the biggest mover of the human soul, love. Now, all of these are, of course, part and parcel of the discussion we're having on migration today. But there seems to be this endless debate about who we should live with, why we should want that, and of course, what we actually do in reality. So migration is a little bit everywhere when you start looking for it. In your everyday life, it's at your preferred Thai diner. It's media junk food, so put a migrant in the story and you'll sell just about any old newspaper. No matter where you stand on this, it is clear that we need to understand properly what makes a migrant. Now, I come to this debate from a rather different angle than most scholars, and I do not think that a migrant is somebody who crossed a border. So a migrant, to be such, doesn't move and doesn't need to move. Doesn't need to move at all. I mean, no travel, not even a quick little trip over the border, nothing. Basically, you can stay at home and beat your own personal record of couch potato, binge movie watching, and still become a migrant. That is because migration is not the same thing as mobility. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not making the claim that a migrant is a migrant no matter whether the border crosses an international or domestic border. It is clear that internally displaced people are displaced, no question about that. My point is different, and it is entirely theoretical. That has to do with the fact that I'm a philosopher of law to be more exact. And this matters here because it is the law that makes the migrant. The law is the technology that we employ in order to determine who counts as a migrant, when, how, why this is so. In other words, let me be clear about this. No law, no migrant. People are just people until you add law to the mix. But once you add law, then you start having all sorts of statuses. You can be an asylum seeker, you can be an investment visa holder, a sponsored spouse, a static EU citizens. There's a jungle of migration statuses out there, but they're all law-made. There's only one thing that you can't be, and that's an economic migrant. That's a media label. For the technology that registers who counts as a migrant and who doesn't, there is no such category as the economic migrant. You can, of course, be an intra-corporate transferee, or a seasonal worker, a holder of a blue card, or of a green card. Sure, there's many economically linked migration statuses, but there's no such thing as the economic migrant. And there's no such thing as the economic migrant that would be such in virtue of not being a forced migrant. This is so because forced migration and voluntary migration do not form a dichotomy. So they're not jointly exhaustive and not mutually exclusive. Basically, it's not like life and death. It's more like day and night with dusk and dawn and all the twilight in between. So, in law, no economic migrants. No law, no migrants. And this is so because migration is not the same thing as mobility. Mobility is a fact. Migration is not. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that people aren't crossing borders. They are crossing borders. Of course they are. And they do so at an increasing pace. But that is not what will make you a migrant. What will make you a migrant is being so registered by the law. So a fancy way of saying this is that law is status generative. It creates statuses, right? Now, and a status is an institutional fact. Think of it as a point in a board game. It's something you can win, it's something you can lose, something that might be worth having, but you can't cash it out. It doesn't correspond to anything. So in that sense, migration statuses are not grounded in people moving. They are grounded in the law. If it weren't for the law, you just couldn't perceive the difference between opening your car door in the morning and jumping the fence at the Spanish Melilla enclave in Northern Africa. Both involve human mobility, but only one will make you a migrant. So having said that, I think that we can push it a little bit further by saying that migration occurs by a pen stroke, by the decision of an office holder. It occurs by a vote in parliament. Mobility cares nothing for this kind of institutional dimension. Perhaps we should even say that we can create citizens and non-citizens by that magic bullet of the law. So what does this mean? Let's assume that I'm right here and that we should make a distinction between migration and mobility. I think this has consequences. I can think of 5. Let me walk you through them. First of all, we're clearly debating the wrong thing. We continue to speak as if the problem was movement across space. But this obsession about space overshadows the fact that it is jurisdictions that will ultimately define who counts as a migrant. And jurisdictions are not locations in space. It's a construct of the law. 2, borders are not porous. I know this is a fashionable metaphor, and so we speak of borders as being interiorized, fragmented, coerced, displaced, etc. But really, the border is an utterly boring place. So unless the state extends its territory, the border won't change, the law will. But what we really want to signify when we speak of porous borders is the fact that the way law categorizes individuals and gives them, ascribes to them their different statuses, is perceived to be strange or counterintuitive. And of course, that's possible. I mean, law isn't always justified. Sometimes it's morally objectionable. Sometimes it's politically unwise. But that won't make the border porous. Then there's the possibility, and this is the 3rd consequence, that the migration crisis might be somewhat policy-induced. So, say, for instance, that visas are hard to get. Well, all other things being equal, that means that it's more likely that entry into that country will occur on an irregular basis. So the stock of irregular presence in a country may depend on its visa policy. This is rather problematic. Some people have even thought that illegal migration is actually a kind of phantom ill. It's like trying to fight your own fist, basically. If this were true, it would follow that we're not dealing with a migration crisis. We're dealing with a policy-induced crisis, something like a fabricated emergency. Then more. To select migrants is also to select voters, because citizenship and migration policy will ultimately determine who will count as a member of the people tomorrow, which is constitutional bedrock. So, if this was true, and we should make that distinction between migration and mobility, it follows that we've got lots of consequences. last but not least, the fact that how you treat others reflect on who you are. So how you design citizenship policy and migration policy will have an effect on your constitutional identity. It impacts your constitutional identity. Both who you admit and who you choose not to admit will reflect on who you will be tomorrow. Okay, so let's recap. We're debating the wrong thing. Borders might not be porous. Maybe we're dealing with a fabricated emergency here. We're actually selecting voters, and all this will have an impact on the constitutional identity of the state. What's the take-home message? Well, you see, it is not mobility that displaces people from institutional structures. It is the law. So, if this is true, then we have to think about that form that law gives to the population, to the people, to those who constitute the citizenry. We have to think about how the citizenry is designed. Gorgias, the famous pre-Socratic sophist, used to joke about the fact that states bow to the pleasure of fabricating citizens out of thin air. And in the course of history, the design of the citizenry has included fabricating citizens and exporting the poor. Now, even as we speak, some 66 million European citizens are about to be transformed into third country nationals as the UK exits the European Union, scheduled for next March. I think that what we need to remember is that form shapes substance. So for you tech-savvy people, it is clear that not any substance can be held in any form. An elegant way to say this is to recall that the Greek word karakter means crucible. It's the container that the blacksmith uses in order to shape the melted iron. So what we need to do is to look very carefully at the crucible, at the form, at those technicalities through which we actually shape the world. If we want to understand the character of our time and how migration changes our character, we need to look at that crucible of the law, not stare cluelessly at the wand, the magic wand of law that makes migrants appear and disappear before our eyes. Thank you.